A quiet diner, a group of loud bikers, and a calm black man they thought they could mock. But when the laughter stopped, they realized too late. This wasn't just any man. This was Snoop Dogg, and what happened next left everyone speechless. The sun hung low over the desert horizon, casting a golden glow across the dusty roadside diner. The hum of motorcycles shattered the quiet as a group of bikers pulled into the parking lot, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves claiming territory. Leather jackets emblazoned with bold, intimidating symbols glinted under the fading light, and their laughter echoed as they dismounted and headed inside. Inside the diner, a jukebox played an old rock tune, blending with the clinking of plates and low murmurs of conversation. The bikers entered loudly, their presence shifting the atmosphere. A waitress near the counter stiffened but forced a polite smile. Regular patrons glanced their way, then quickly returned to their meals, unwilling to invite attention. At a corner booth, a tall, lean man sat quietly, scrolling on his phone. He wore a simple hoodie, dark sunglasses, and sneakers that looked both stylish and comfortable. His laid-back demeanor made him almost blend into the diner's modest crowd, but there was something unmistakable about his presence. Calm, collected, but confident. The bikers took the largest table, their loud chatter drowning out the jukebox. They laughed boisterously, throwing around crude jokes, some with an edge of bigotry that made the other patrons visibly uncomfortable. They ignored the waitress's hesitant approach until one of them barked for beer and burgers, laughing as she hurried away. The man in the corner stayed focused on his phone, seemingly unfazed by the rising tension. But the bikers noticed him. One of them nudged the leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a commanding presence. "Hey," he said with a smirk, "look at that guy over there." Think he got lost? The leader turned, his piercing eyes locking onto the man in the corner. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for the diner to hear. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity, or maybe just a wannabe." The man didn't look up. He continued scrolling, his posture relaxed, as if the comments didn't concern him. The waitress returned with the biker's order, setting down plates and mugs with shaky hands. The leader leaned toward her, jerking a thumb at the man in the corner. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. "That guy one of yours, or did he wander in from some rap video?" The waitress flushed, avoiding eye contact. "He's just a customer," she said softly, stepping back quickly. The bikers erupted into laughter, clinking their mugs together in mock celebration. The leader stood, stretching exaggeratedly before strolling over to the corner booth. His boots thudded heavily against the tile floor, the sound drawing everyone's attention. He stopped in front of the booth, towering over the man seated there. "Hey, buddy," he said with a smirk. "You lost? This ain't exactly a place for, well, your kind." Finally, the man looked up, slowly removing his sunglasses. His calm gaze met the biker's sneering face, and he leaned back slightly, folding his arms across his chest. "My kind?" he asked, his tone steady and unbothered. The biker chuckled, looking back at his crew for validation. "Yeah, you know. Out here we don't do whatever it is you do. But hey, maybe you're just passing through. No harm in that, right?" The man smiled faintly, setting his sunglasses on the table. "No harm at all," he replied, his voice low but carrying a quiet authority that made the biker hesitate for just a second. But the hesitation passed, and the biker leaned in closer. "You know," he said, his tone turning sharper, "we don't take too kindly to people acting like they're better than us. You're in the wrong place, friend." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "You sure about that?" The calm response seemed to irritate the biker further. He straightened up, puffing out his chest. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" The tension in the diner thickened. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping a coffee pot. Other patrons avoided eye contact, nervously watching the unfolding scene through sideways glances. Still seated, the man adjusted his hoodie, revealing a small gold chain that caught the light. His calm expression didn't change as he said, "I don't think you realize who you're talking to." The biker laughed, turning to his crew. "Oh, I think we do. You're just another nobody trying to act like you belong here." The man's faint smile returned. "Well," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you're about to find out how wrong you are." The biker leader stood by the booth, his arms crossed as his smirk widened. Behind him, the rest of the crew cheered him on with crude jokes, their laughter loud enough to fill the small diner. The man seated before him remained calm, his posture relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. The contrast between their energies only seemed to irritate the leader further. "You think you're special, huh?" the leader sneered. He leaned in, planting both hands on the edge of the table. "Walking in here like you own the place." The man didn't respond immediately. He picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "I didn't walk in here to prove anything to you," he said evenly, his voice carrying a calm authority. The leader's face darkened. "Real funny," he muttered. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew. "You hear that? Thinks he's got jokes." One of the bikers, a wiry young man with a shaved head, chimed in, "Maybe he should stick to singing for his supper." The table erupted in laughter again. The man at the booth simply adjusted his hoodie, revealing a glimpse of a gold chain resting against his chest. The small movement didn't go unnoticed. The leader raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "What's that? You showing off now?" he asked, gesturing to the chain. "Think a little bling is going to impress us?" The man tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting the leader's. "Not trying to impress anyone," he said, "but maybe you should take a step back before you say something you'll regret." The laughter at the bikers' table faltered slightly, the tension shifting. One of the older bikers, a heavy-set man with graying hair, leaned forward. "Hey, maybe we should just let it go," he muttered, his tone uncertain. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't about to let some stranger get the better of him in front of his crew. "Let it go?" he scoffed. "No way. This guy needs to learn where he stands." The leader straightened up, towering over the booth. He jabbed a finger toward the man's chest. "You're in our territory now, and out here we don't take kindly to people who don't respect that." The man's entourage, who had been quietly sitting at a nearby table, exchanged glances. They remained seated, their calm composure mirroring the man's, but their eyes sharpened as they watched the interaction. The waitress, who had been frozen at the counter, finally found her voice. "Please, let's not do this," she said, her tone pleading. She stepped forward hesitantly, clutching a coffee pot like a lifeline. "We don't want any trouble." The leader turned to her, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said. "We're just having a friendly chat, right?" The man at the booth gave her a faint nod, his expression reassuring. "No trouble here," he said softly. But the leader wasn't finished. Emboldened by the laughter of his crew, he leaned closer, lowering his voice to a mocking drawl. "Tell me something. You sing about the hood and all that, right? Bet you've never been in a real fight in your life." The man's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign that the insults were beginning to wear thin. "You don't know anything about me?" he replied, his voice still calm but edged with warning. "Oh, I think I know enough," the leader said, his smirk returning. "You're just another city boy playing tough, thinking your money or your fame makes you untouchable." One of the younger bikers, who had been scrolling on his phone, suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he looked between his screen and the man at the booth. Hey, boss," he said nervously, nudging the leader. "Not now," the leader snapped without looking back. "No, seriously," the younger biker insisted, his voice shaking slightly. "You might want to see this." The leader turned reluctantly, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it?" The younger biker held up his phone, showing a video clip. The leader's eyes flicked to the screen, and his smirk faded instantly. The color drained from his face as recognition set in. The man in the booth leaned back slightly, watching the realization dawn on the leader. "Told you," he said quietly. "You didn't know who you were talking to." The leader stammered, his bravado crumbling. "You're—" "That's right," the man said, his faint smile returning. The younger biker leaned in, whispering urgently, "Boss, that's Snoop Dogg." The Snoop Dogg. The leader's jaw dropped as the weight of his mistake hit him. He turned back to the booth, his earlier arrogance replaced with a mix of shock and panic. I didn't know," he stuttered. "You didn't care to know," Snoop replied evenly. "That's the problem." The other bikers began whispering among themselves, their confidence evaporating. One by one, they looked down at their plates, avoiding eye contact. The leader took a step back, his hands raised in a weak gesture of surrender. "Look, man, we didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly. Snoop raised an eyebrow. "Didn't mean anything. Seemed like you had a lot to say a minute ago." The leader struggled for words, his earlier bravado completely gone. The waitress, who had been watching anxiously, let out a quiet sigh of relief as the tension began to dissipate. Snoop stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming even more imposing now. He adjusted his hoodie, placed his sunglasses back on, and turned to the leader. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Don't judge people based on what you think you know. It'll save you from looking like a fool." The leader nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. Yeah, of course. Won't happen again." Snoop gave him a long, steady look before heading toward the door. His entourage followed, their calm demeanor unbroken. As the door swung shut behind them, the diner fell silent, the bikers sitting in awkward, humiliated silence. The waitress finally exhaled, a small smile forming as she looked out the window at Snoop and his crew walking away. The air in the diner was heavy with an uneasy silence. The leader of the bikers stood frozen, his earlier bravado shattered as recognition dawned on his face. His crew exchanged nervous glances, the reality of their situation sinking in. For a group used to being the loudest voices in the room, their confidence had vanished like smoke in the wind. Snoop Dogg remained standing by his booth, his calm gaze locked onto the leader. His entourage flanked him, their quiet confidence speaking volumes. The tension was palpable, but Snoop's steady demeanor commanded the space. "You figured it out yet?" Snoop asked, his tone casual but carrying an edge of authority. The leader fumbled for words, his voice a hoarse whisper. I didn't know it was you." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "Didn't think to ask, did you?" The younger biker who had shown the video earlier leaned over to another crew member, whispering urgently, "Man, that's the real Snoop Dogg. We're talking about the Snoop Dogg." The murmurs grew among the group, some now stealing cautious glances at Snoop. The leader, however, was still rooted in place, his hands twitching slightly as if searching for something to hold on to. Look, we didn't mean nothing by it," the leader stammered, his voice faltering. "Didn't mean nothing," Snoop repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "You men enough to come over here, start running your mouth, and try to disrespect me. That wasn't an accident." The leader's face flushed, and he looked down, unable to meet Snoop's eyes. Behind him, the rest of the crew fidgeted in awkward silence, their earlier arrogance completely deflated. Snoop took a slow step forward, his presence commanding. "You see, that's the problem with folks like you. Quick to judge, quick to run your mouth, but slow to think." One of the older bikers, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "We didn't know who you were, man. Honest mistake." Snoop's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A mistake?" he asked. "Nah, a mistake is tripping over your shoelaces. What y'all did was a choice." The older biker nodded nervously. "You're right. We were out of line." Out of line, Snoop repeated, as if testing the phrase. He nodded once. Yeah, you were. But here's the thing. It's not just me you're out of line with. It's anybody who doesn't look like you, isn't it? The leader stiffened, his embarrassment now giving way to visible discomfort. It's not like that, he muttered. We're not racist or anything. Snoop raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. Oh, you're not, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Then explain what all that was about earlier. All the jokes, all the big talk. Because it sure didn't sound like respect to me. The leader had no response, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. Snoop took another step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its weight. Here's the thing, man. You don't get to walk around thinking you can disrespect people and get away with it. Not in my presence. Not anywhere. The crew shifted uncomfortably, their earlier camaraderie now replaced with a collective sense of unease. The younger biker glanced at the leader, as if silently pleading for him to say something to defuse the situation. But the leader, for the first time, seemed completely at a loss. The waitress, who had been hovering nervously behind the counter, finally stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Dogg," she said, her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry for what happened. Some of us... Well, we appreciate what you're doing here." Snoop turned to her, his expression softening. "Appreciate you too," he said, giving her a small nod. Her words seemed to break the tension slightly, though the weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air. "You know," Snoop said, turning back to the leader, "it don't cost you nothing to treat people with respect. But disrespect, that'll cost you everything." The leader's shoulders sagged as the words hit home. He glanced at his crew, who now looked at him with a mix of frustration and disappointment. The younger biker finally stepped forward, his voice tentative but steady. "We messed up," he said. "We shouldn't have acted like that. It wasn't right." Snoop studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Takes a lot to admit when you're wrong," he said. "More than most people got. But it ain't just about saying it. It's about changing it." The younger biker nodded quickly. "We will. I will." Snoop took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the group. "That's on y'all to prove," he said simply. "But let me tell you something. When you mess with the wrong person, you better be ready for the consequences." The leader looked up at that, his expression tense. "What kind of consequences?" he asked warily. Snoop smiled faintly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "You'll see soon enough." With that, Snoop turned and walked toward the door, his entourage following closely behind. The air seemed to shift as they exited, the silence in the diner now heavy with a mix of relief and reflection. The waitress watched him go, then turned back to the bikers. "Y'all better think about what just happened," she said quietly. "'Cause I don't think he's the kind of man you want to cross twice." The leader sat down heavily, running a hand over his face. "We really screwed up, didn't we?" he muttered. The younger biker nodded grimly. "Yeah, we did." Outside, Snoop climbed into his sleek black SUV, the tension in his shoulders easing as the door shut. His crew exchanged glances, but none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The SUV pulled away, leaving the diner behind. But the lessons Snoop had delivered lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The once rowdy diner had fallen into a deep, uncomfortable silence. The laughter and smug remarks of the bikers had faded completely, replaced by awkward shuffling and downcast gazes. The leader, who had carried himself with arrogance minutes earlier, now sat stiffly at the table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Snoop Dogg's calm, commanding words hung in the air like an invisible weight. The other patrons, who had been watching nervously, exchanged quiet glances. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. No one spoke, their attention fixed on the scene unfolding at the center of the diner. "You see," Snoop began, his tone low and deliberate, "it don't cost nothing to show respect. But disrespect, that'll cost you everything." The leader's face flushed red, his earlier bravado shattered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the realization of his mistake sinking in with every word Snoop spoke. "I wasn't trying to... we didn't know," he stammered, his usual confidence replaced by visible unease. "That's the problem," Snoop replied sharply, his gaze never wavering. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You saw me sitting here minding my business and you thought you could talk slick. You thought you could make me small." The younger biker, the one who had first recognized Snoop, leaned forward hesitantly. His voice was quieter than before, but his words carried weight. "We really didn't mean to disrespect you. We were just messing around." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression both calm and incredulous. "Messing around?" he repeated. "You think talking down to people making assumptions about who they are is just a joke? You think that's funny?" The younger biker lowered his head, unable to meet Snoop's eyes. "No, sir, it's not," he admitted quietly. The leader bristled slightly, his pride still holding on. "Look," he said, his voice gruff, "we've been through a lot. We're not bad people. We just don't take kindly to strangers who act like they're better than us." Snoop let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Better than you? Man, I was sitting in that booth drinking my coffee, bothering nobody. But you took one look at me and decided who I was. Now you're telling me it's my fault you disrespected me? You gotta do better than that." The waitress, who had been standing near the counter watching the interaction, finally stepped forward. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but her voice carried newfound courage. "He's right," she said, her gaze fixed on the leader. "You walked in here like you owned the place. You've been making people uncomfortable all night, not just him. It's not okay." The leader opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The rest of the bikers sat in awkward silence, their usual camaraderie replaced by visible discomfort. Snoop stepped closer to the table, his voice soft but firm. "Let me tell y'all something," he said. "Respect ain't just about how you treat someone you think is important. It's about how you treat everybody. You don't get to pick and choose who deserves it." One of the older bikers, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "We hear you," he said, his voice low. "We were wrong." The younger biker nodded quickly. "Yeah, we messed up big time." Snoop studied them for a moment, his gaze steady. "Admitting you're wrong is the first step," he said. "But words don't mean nothing without action. You want to make this right? Start by looking at how you treat people every day, not just when you get called out for it." The leader sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. He glanced around the diner, taking in the uneasy expressions of his crew, the waitress, and the other patrons. "You're right," he said finally. "We do need to do better." Snoop nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Glad to hear it," he said. "Now, let's make sure it sticks." Snoop stepped out into the cool night air, the tension from the encounter still lingering in his chest. His entourage followed him, their expressions a mix of pride and quiet reflection. "That was intense," one of them said, breaking the silence. Snoop shrugged. "It needed to be," he replied. "People don't change unless you make them uncomfortable." Another member of his crew, an older man with a salt and pepper beard, chuckled softly. "You handled that like a pro, though. Most folks would have gone off, but you kept your cool." Snoop smiled faintly, adjusting his sunglasses. "Losing your cool don't teach anybody anything," he said. "All it does is give them an excuse to say they were right about you." The younger member of the crew frowned. "Still, man, it's got to get old. Dealing with stuff like that after everything you've accomplished." Snoop's expression grew serious. "Nobody's above being disrespected," he said. "But respect isn't about what you get. It's about what you give. That's what people remember." He paused, glancing back at the diner. Through the windows, he could see the bikers still seated at their table, their heads bent in quiet conversation. "You think they'll change?" one of his crew members asked. "That's up to them," Snoop replied. but at least now they know better. The waitress approached the bikers cautiously, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You know," she said, her voice steady, "he didn't have to say anything. He could have just left. But he stayed because he wanted to teach you something." The leader nodded slowly. "We get it," he said. "We messed up." The younger biker spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm gonna do better," he said. "I mean it." The waitress gave them a small, hesitant smile. "Good, because people deserve better than what y'all did tonight." As she walked away, the leader let out a heavy sigh. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head. "We really screwed up." The older biker placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but at least we got a chance to fix it." The diner settled into a tentative calm after the confrontation, but the atmosphere was far from its earlier carefree rowdiness. The bikers remained seated at their table, their meals untouched, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and contemplation. For a group that had entered with unchecked arrogance, the humbling encounter had left them visibly shaken. The leader, once the loudest voice in the room, now sat with his head lowered, his fingers drumming softly on the table. The younger biker, who had recognized Snoop, broke the silence. "Man," he said, his voice low, "that was Snoop Dogg. Like, the Snoop Dogg. And we disrespected him." Another biker, older and gruffer, shook his head. "Doesn't matter who he was. We shouldn't have treated anybody like that," he muttered. "We acted like fools." The leader looked up, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, well, maybe I wouldn't have acted like that if he hadn't walked in here like he owned the place," he grumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. The older biker gave him a hard stare. "You really believe that? Or are you just saying it so you don't feel guilty?" The leader's shoulders slumped. He let out a deep sigh, leaning back in his chair. "All right, fine," he admitted. "I messed up. We all did." He looked around at his crew. "We gotta own this." The waitress, who had been quietly refilling cups at another table, approached cautiously. "You know," she began, her voice steady but kind, "owning it is a start. But it's what you do next that really matters." The younger biker nodded. "She's right," he said. "We can't just sit here and feel bad about it. We gotta do something different." The leader glanced at him, then at the waitress. "Like what?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "Well," the waitress replied, "maybe start by thinking about why you acted that way in the first place. Why'd you feel the need to talk down to him? To try to make him small?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. The leader rubbed his temples, a look of frustration crossing his face. "I don't know," he said finally. "I guess I just assumed things about him, about who he was." "That's your problem right there," the waitress said gently. "You assumed, and when you assume the worst about people, you'll never give them a fair chance." The leader fell silent, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Snoop leaned against his SUV, his entourage standing nearby. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of resolution. "You think they'll learn something from this?" one of his crew members asked, breaking the silence. Snoop shrugged, adjusting his hoodie. "That's on them," he said. "I gave them something to think about. What they do with it is their business." The older member of the crew nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you handled that better than most people would have. You could have walked out, but you didn't." Snoop smiled faintly. Walking out wouldn't have taught them anything. Sometimes people need to be called out so they can see what they're doing wrong. The youngest member of the entourage frowned. "But why bother? Why not just let them stay ignorant?" Snoop turned to him, his expression serious. "Because ignorance doesn't just hurt the person who has it. It spreads. It hurts the people they look down on, the people they teach their ways to. If I can stop that cycle even for a minute, it's worth it." His words settled over the group, a quiet reminder of why they followed his lead. Inside the diner, the leader stood, throwing a few bills on the table to cover their meals. "Let's go," he said gruffly, motioning for his crew to follow. As they made their way to the door, the younger biker paused, turning to the waitress. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "Thanks for saying what you said. I needed to hear it." She smiled softly. "It's never too late to change," she replied. The bikers stepped outside, the cool desert air hitting them as they approached their motorcycles. They climbed on, the leader at the front, his face still etched with tension. As the engines roared to life, the leader glanced at the SUV parked nearby. Snoop stood leaning against it, his calm gaze meeting the leader's for a brief moment. The leader nodded, a small, reluctant gesture of respect, before revving his bike and leading his crew away into the night. The story didn't end there. Over the following weeks, the bikers found themselves reflecting on what had happened. The younger members began questioning the attitudes they had once adopted without thought. The leader, though slower to change, couldn't shake the impact of Snoop's words. Back at the diner, the waitress shared her experience with other patrons, who marveled at how the confrontation had played out. "He didn't just stand up for himself," she said. "He made them see how wrong they were. That takes real strength." Snoop, meanwhile, continued on his journey, his actions leaving behind a legacy of humility and respect. For those who had witnessed the event, it wasn't just a lesson in standing up against prejudice. It was a reminder of the power of dignity and the importance of treating every person with humanity. The desert sun rose slowly the next morning, casting a soft golden light over the empty diner parking lot. Inside, the waitress wiped down the counter, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. She had witnessed something extraordinary, an encounter that began with arrogance and hostility, but ended with humility and self-reflection. It wasn't often that moments like this played out in real life. Word of the incident began to spread, first among the locals who frequented the diner and then beyond. One of the patrons had captured part of the exchange on their phone, posting it to social media with the caption, "Snoop Dogg teaches some bikers a lesson they'll never forget." The video quickly gained traction, racking up thousands of shares within hours. The footage showed Snoop standing calm and composed as the leader of the bikers fumbled with excuses. His words, sharp, measured, and impactful, resonated deeply with viewers. Comments poured in, praising Snoop's dignity and restraint. Many people shared their own experiences of facing prejudice and bias, turning the post into a broader conversation about respect and accountability. Meanwhile, the bikers were grappling with their own reckoning. The younger members especially couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The youngest, who had recognized Snoop first, found himself replaying the moment in his mind over and over. He began questioning the attitudes and behaviors he had absorbed from the group, realizing for the first time how wrong they had been. The leader wasn't immune to the ripple effect either. Though slower to reflect, he couldn't ignore the impact of Snoop's words. Late at night, sitting alone in their garage, he found himself replaying the confrontation in his head. For the first time in years, he wondered if his bravado and prejudices had cost him more than he'd ever realized. For Snoop, it was just another day. He didn't seek recognition or accolades for what had happened. To him, standing up for himself and others was simply the right thing to do. But the incident had a life of its own, inspiring countless people who heard about it to reflect on their own behavior. Months later, the diner waitress received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from the youngest biker. "Thank you for speaking up that night. I've thought about it a lot since then. I'm working on being better, and I hope I can set a better example for others someday. Please tell Mr. Dogg that what he said changed more than he might think." The waitress smiled as she folded the letter. She couldn't say for sure if the bikers had completely changed, but she knew they had been forced to confront a side of themselves they could no longer ignore. That was progress, and progress was always worth something. Out in the world, the video continued to circulate, sparking discussions about how to handle prejudice with dignity and strength. For many, Snoop's actions became a blueprint for turning conflict into a teachable moment, proving that true power lies not in retaliation, but in grace.